here at the Middle East Institute in Washington, and I'm pleased to welcome you all to today's book event with our three wonderful panelists. The title of the book is Defending Iran from Revolutionary Guards to Ballistic Missiles. The two authors are Professor Gawdat Bahgat from the Near East South Asia Center for Strategic Study at the National Defense University here in Washington. Then we have Professor Anoushiravan Ehteshami from the School of Government and International Affairs at Durham University in the United Kingdom. The two authors will be joined by Dr. Sara Bazoobandi, who is a non-resident fellow at the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington and a fellow at German Institute of Global and Area Studies in Hamburg, Germany. Before I introduce the book and begin the discussion, just a few quick admin points. Please submit your questions using the Zoom's Q&A feature, which you can find on your Zoom screens. For those calling in by phone or watching our panel on the live stream, you can ask a question by emailing events@mei.edu. If you have any technical issues, please use the same email to let us know. Again, it's events@mei.edu. Do feel free to ask a question at any time throughout the panel. I'll be looking for your questions and I'll factor in as many as I can during this 1 hour book discussion that I'm very much looking forward to. First, let me congratulate Gawdat and Anoush with producing this rich and timely book on the issue of Iranian defense strategy. The book is divided into 10 chapters and focuses on how Iran's defense posture of today has been shaping up since 1979. The book has a lot to say about the defense policymaking process in Tehran, but it also has a lot to say about how shifting regional landscape has pushed Iran in this direction, where it has invested so much in capabilities such as foreign militant proxy groups that Iran can call upon, or its investment in a ballistic missiles program, as the title of the book would give away, Iran's cyber program, and generally asymmetric capabilities. So let me start off by asking our two authors, Gawdat and Anoush, and whoever wants to go first, please do so. Tell us, the audience, why this book, why now, and what were your main takeaways in the 2 years of research and decades of experience that you have between you in looking at Iran and Middle Eastern security matters? Floor is yours.
Anoush, would you like to go first?
No, you've started, so go ahead, Gawdat.
Okay. Thank you first, Alex, for hosting us, and it's great to be with your great institution, Middle East Institute, and also with great scholar like you, and also Sarah and my dear friend Anoush. I believe the main reason we thought about this book is there is obsession with Iran nuclear program. It's like everything about Iran is the nuclear program. Iran is much more than the nuclear program. Iran is a nation of ancient civilization and huge economic, cultural, military capabilities. And I believe this obsession with the nuclear program is not accurate. I mean, if you just Google Iran nuclear program, you'll find millions of heading. And the Israeli Prime Minister, former Prime Minister Netanyahu, has been saying Iran will get the bomb next year since late 1980s. So at the same time, Iran denies having nuclear bomb or having the intention to make the bomb. And based on open sources, what we know till today, Iran does not have the bomb. On the other hand, Iranian leaders talk all the time about other military capabilities, including missiles. All the time, they show their missiles, they show their small boats, they show their drones, they talk about cyber, and they do not take responsibility for cyber attacks, but they talk about their cyber capabilities. So we thought to focus on the real issues, what we know for sure, instead of speculating on if Iran has or does not have the bomb. Very briefly, my main takeaway from the book, I believe there is need to define what winning is. Iran has been in confrontation with the United States since the revolution till today, and it is important to define what the term winning means. I remember Kissinger once said, when professional big army does not win, it means it loses, and when militia does not lose, it means it wins. Iranian military capabilities are nothing compared with the United States, but so far the Iranian Islamic Republic has been in office for more than 42 years. And what we know based on open sources, the regime is in control. There are no any signs that the Islamic Republic is about to collapse. And probably lastly, what I learned from the book, something happened before in other countries. The weaker side has options. There is no doubt that the United States has much more capabilities, but it does not mean the weaker side, in this case Iran, is out of options. And this is what the book is about, asymmetric warfare, the different options Iran exercises. I turn to you, Anoush.
First of all, can I add my thanks to you, Alex, and Middle East Institute, as well as to Sara for kindly being with us and hosting us so ably as well. And welcome to everybody. I see that a number of attendees are going up as we speak, which is wonderful to see. Why this book? Well, I want to start on the personal level and to say that I've been following Iran, writing on Iran, as you know, for a very long time. And while the focus has been on Iran's international relations, I've delved into its security policies, bits and pieces, but never really gave it the focus and attention it deserved. And this book arose from another project that Gawdat and I were doing, looking very much at security in the region and trying to pivot it around Iran. And it's the genesis of the book goes back to those earlier conversations we had, actually as it happened in Chatham House some years back, discussing Iran and regional security. And we felt that this issue is very different from Iran's international relations per se. It's not about foreign policy. It's about defense doctrine. And while there are partisan material on this, there is nothing that objectively analyzes and, if you like, unpacks Iran's defense doctrine and its strategy. And we felt that this is something that we ought to do together, given our interests and what we bring to the party. And so that is the origin of the book. And why now is that we were very keen to get the book out as we are going through yet another cycle of change that we're witnessing in both Iran, in the region, and also in the United States. And our publisher was also very keen to make sure that the book is published in good time, early cycle of President Biden's presidency, and hence the book is there now. In terms of takeaways, to cover other aspects that Gawdat is ably done so far, the first is to begin to understand where defense strategy comes from. What is its origin in a revolutionary state? You know, we use the term revolutionary often in an abstract form. What we wanted to do was to get under the skin of when a revolution of historic proportions happens, like the Russian Revolution, like the Chinese Revolution. What is the impact of that on the country concerned, but also on the wider environment? And that was very much our starting point. And what we found, not surprisingly, is that revolution had a devastating, but also transformative impact on Iran. That Iran was both a shaper and a victim of circumstances. And that is very much the dialectical relationship that we still see in terms of Iran's security strategy, but also parameters of its security discussions. So that was important. But for me in particular, Alex, it was the issue of creeping militarization of defense and strategy in Iran. We assume that defense is all about military, but often it isn't. And in Iran, it definitely wasn't. There was a very clear distinction between the civilian elite and the military elite. What struck me as we got deeper and deeper into the research was that they began to overlap. And that was partly a result of domestic conditions, but particularly a product of regional dynamics, where the securitization of the region actually fed into the securitization of the regime, and as a consequence, elevated the position of the military establishment, in particular the RGC, in that broader decision-making process. But also, as Iran drove its military self-sufficiency, it's very clear that they began to lean much more heavily on the RGC to lead that process of an asymmetrical preparation. So we devote a lot of time in the book, as you know, to looking at Iran's military-industrial complex, where we feel that we've brought new analysis and material to the table on that. That would be the other critical takeaway for me. I'll stop there because I know you have plenty to ask.
Thank you, Anoush. Let me actually follow up with a question for first you, and then I'll go back to Gawdat, and then I'll turn to Sara. You touched on, since the revolution, Iran has been a shaper and a victim in terms of what's going on in the Middle East. And in fact, that reminded me of something that I read in this wonderful book, which I highly recommend. It's rich, it's timely, and anybody interested in Iran should really pick up a copy. In the book, you have at one point a reference to the triple impact that, you know, shapes Iranian defense calculations. You talk about the revolution of '79, you talk about the war, the Iran-Iraq war of 1980 to 88, and then you talk about the impact on the sanctions. And then just right now, Anoush, you talked about the securitization of the regime and then the securitization of the region. One of the big questions for anyone who wants to sort of, those of us who are, you know, looking to make sense of what Tehran does, we want to ask the question, and I know you deal with this at length in your book, what came first? Did Iran upset the regional balance? Did Iran's, because you talk about this openly in the book, you talk about the tone, particularly 1980s, the tone that Islamic Republic adopts scares countries in it. That Iran is the reason why they go looking for military supplies and new military partners, on which we see to this day with the Abraham Accords and so forth. So, what do you think happened? I mean, if you go back to the triple impact, revolution, war, and sanctions, would I be off by saying without the revolution, there wouldn't have been war, there wouldn't be sanctions on Iran today?
Oh, absolutely, Alex. I think the revolution caused a major geostrategic displacement. And it's that displacement that interrupts the status quo. But you cannot then create the status quo ante again, because the timeline has changed. And once that happens, of course, everybody's position in that space changes. So while Iran is kind of rotating between these spheres, it is having a knock-on effect on everything else in its environment. And by the time it becomes aware of this, that environment has changed so much that its previous policies will not create the effects that he's looking for. So without a doubt, the revolution caused a displacement in the fabric of the region, and the region is still coming to terms with it, because this, like the other great revolutions, was a truly historic milestone. And that shift, that tear in the geostrategic map of the region cannot be put together again in the way that it was. And as we plow history, we create new dynamics. And so we are now held in this whirlwind of change because we haven't really found a new pivot that would allow the countries to get together. And by we, I mean not just Iran and its neighbors, I mean also the international community that we need to refer to as well.
Thank you, Anoush. Gawdat, one of the things about your book, which I think is so important to point out, is that you rely on primary research in multiple languages, Persian, Arabic, Hebrew, and so forth. Let me turn to the Arabic sources and ask the following question. How much sympathy is there in the broader Arab world for Iran's security doctrine and predicaments that they, I mean, when you're sitting in Cairo, I mean, we kind of have a good sense of what the feeling is if you're sitting in Riyadh or in Abu Dhabi. They're closer to Iran and they have a different sense of urgency about the Iranian issue. But if you're sitting, say, in Egypt or elsewhere in the Arab world, what your research, what did it tell you about the consensus among Arab observers, commentators, analysts who looked at the issue of Iran? And I brought Egypt up because of the Egyptian foreign minister, I believe, is in visiting the United States. There's a meeting going on, and the issue of Iran had come up. So, Gawdat, please tell us.
There is very little sympathy for Iran in the Arab world. And one reason for this, like many countries now in the Arab world, including Egypt, Syria, Yemen, Lebanon, they are going through very hard economic times. They need money. Iran does not have the money. And Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates are using checkbook diplomacy. They have the money. And especially now, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, he's young and he's willing to use his financial muscles, financial resources. And there is also a kind of competition between major Arab countries, like especially like Egypt. Egypt has always perceived itself as the leader, not only of the Arab world, but of the entire Middle East, and Iran. Long time ago, I published an article on Egypt and Iran relations, and the two countries do not have any reason to be enemies, but Egypt needs Gulf money, and in order to get Gulf money, they have to be anti-Iran. So Arab sources, they are against, they are not sympathetic to Iran. On the other hand, Iran tries to reach out to Arab countries because it does not want to be isolated. So what I found in this research on Egyptian-Iranian relations, Iran is always trying to reach out to Egypt. Iran wants, because Egypt as major Arab country, Iran wants to break the isolation. Egypt wants Gulf money, does not want to normalize relations with Iran. I mean, Egypt is one of very few countries in the world that has not had ambassador in Tehran since the Shah went to Egypt, 1980. So more than 40 years, no Egyptian ambassador in Tehran. I believe the only two countries, United States and Israel, who have not had ambassador in Tehran.
Very good point. Thank you. And Sara, let me turn to you, if I may. One of the themes that we, see appear and reappear in the book is this issue of Iranian sort of isolation, the sense of isolation. I wanted to ask you if you could sort of touch on the issue of the Iranian public sentiment about the question of why Iran is isolated. If you follow, and as you do, we all do, the sort of the diaspora and the opposition in Iran, you often hear that the isolation is a self-inflicted wound. We don't need to be isolated. We are isolated because we've chosen ideology over the national interest. Where do you think we are on this issue 42 years after the Islamic Republic was born?
Thank you very much. Allow me to join you again in congratulating Anoush and Gawdat first for the amazing book. And there are not very many texts out there that can bring together history, security details, all the foreign policy dynamics, the scholarly fact-based multiple source research together. So that is a truly impressive piece of work. Congratulations again, and thank you very much for hosting this session, Alex. Look, on the question of the public sentiment, one of the characteristics of the current global politics that basically runs through almost all the communities and political systems across the world is the division of societies. And Iranian society is not an exception to that trend. Iranian society is divided as a result of years of corruption, nepotism, socioeconomic, political pressure, and so on, that has affected the social cohesion of the society. But it's not that black and white. You cannot really divide this into the society into pro-regime and versus anti-regime groups, because the public debate shows that the division goes far beyond the political ideology into religious values, into understanding of the global and regional dynamics, into understanding of the past, and by comparing the previous monarchs of Iran with the current Islamic revolutionary regime, and so on and so forth. But having kept all of these nuances in mind and these complexities, there are some very visible trends here, as you clearly and rightly mentioned. The state is investing heavily in its soft power, promotion of its own political agenda at domestic, regional, and international level through broadcast, digital, online, social media, the government-sponsored activities like so-called cyber army, English and Arabic TV channels, online news websites. They have all been actively trying to justify the regime policies for decades. In the absence of reliable polls, obviously, it's very hard to assess the influence of these activities on public opinion. Having said that, the general public reaction, especially on social media and through some of the media platforms that are based in the diaspora, and generally the academics, journalists, political activists inside and outside of Iran, indicates that there is a strong sense of frustration and resentment against the political system and these never-ending regional ambitions and these suppressive strategies at home. So combine all of these reasons for having this sense of and rising sense of resentment and frustration, combine all of this with a catastrophic state of Iranian economy caused again by years of sanction, corruption, economic mismanagement that has led to widespread poverty, significant deterioration of living conditions. As a result of that, people have been chanting on the streets of Tehran in several episodes of unrests, no to Gaza, no to Lebanon, and we will give up our lives for Iran. So there's clearly a sense of disagreement and a sense of resentment against the prioritization of regional activities over, tackling issues at home. So this is, also reflected in waves of migration, massive waves of migration. Recent government data shows that every year more than 250,000 of Iranians are leaving the country. Iran has been top buyer of Turkish properties over the past years, every year in the region, in such a conflict-driven region that people are voluntarily or by force displaced in various parts of the region. But the Iranians, yet supposedly a stable country, they are amongst the highest buyers of properties outside of Iran. The capital outflow, low rate birth rate, and all of this shows that there is a strong sense of resentment and frustration, and the state has failed basically to address these issues at home, whilst it has been extremely busy with trying to expand its power and position outside and across the region.
Thank you, Sarah. I totally agree with everything you said, and you see the Islamic Republic struggling to convince its own public about the narrative. I mean, and sometimes it shows itself in interesting ways. I mean, just this week we had the Iranian women's basketball team playing the basketball team of the country of Syria. The Iranian basketball players had to have the veil on because of the ideology of the Islamic Republic. And the basketball players from Syria did not have to put on the veil. And they incidentally beat the Iranian team. But on social media, it was so interesting to see how people were saying, so you've been saying the last 10 years, we're going to Syria to defend our Shia Islamist values. And look, what values? We don't have any common values with the Assad regime. So anyway, it's just interesting. But let me turn to the book, Anoush. The Iran-Iraq war in this book is a pivotal chapter. And you go back to it again and again. What are the key lessons that the authorities in Tehran learned then and continue perhaps to abide by some of those lessons to this day?
fantastic question, Alex. I think the first lesson is that revolutions bring violence upon themselves. And again, that is a repeated fact of history. It part and parcel of this geostrategic displacement. But in particular the case of Iran, it first validated Iran's revolutionary ideology, that actually finding itself isolated was a blessing, but also a vindication of neither East nor West. For Ayatollah Khomeini, this was evidence, if anybody needed, that Iran is better off without any association with the Western powers or the Warsaw-backed powers, and that both the Soviet Union and the United States were predator powers. And in the war, they proved it for the revolutionaries because they both, in different ways, backed the Iraqis. So there is an ideological validation, if you like. The second was the material. The material was that having burnt its bridges with its main military suppliers, United States and Great Britain, it was now stuck in the mud. It needed piecemeal solutions. And if necessity is the mother of invention, Iranians had to put the vast array of military hardware that the Shah had put in front of them to good use by dismantling it to learn how to put it back together again. So reverse engineering was another lesson that they learned, and it feeds directly into the military industrial complex today. So much of Iran's, for example, drone sophisticated technology comes from what they've shot down by the United States, and reverse engineer and learn from that process. The next lesson was that you need to be self-sufficient, that the world out there is an angry, hostile place, and that you need to find your own response and resources to defend the revolution, not the state, the revolution. And that is where the proxy dimension comes into play. If you want to defend the state, you defend it with your conventional forces, and if you're really hotshot, with some WMDs. Iran is not a hotshot, as Gawdat has already pointed out on the WMD front. So, but if you don't have access to the conventional forces that sustain your military structures, then you have to find alternatives. And this is the origins of asymmetrical doctrine, where you begin to find new tools, invent new tools of deterrence. The ultimate lesson that they learned from the war was, how do we deter enemies? How do we keep them at bay? But most importantly, how do we keep them away from the borders of our revolution? How do we fight these wars elsewhere if we can? And how do we deter them before they get to us? And ultimately also not to trust anybody, because at the end of the day, they're all in it for themselves.
Yeah. Alex, if I may, can I add 2 points to what Anoush said?
Of course.
First, I believe the Iran-Iraq war was gift to the Islamic Republic because at that time there were different factions fighting each other, and it was not clear if the religious faction will win. So having foreign enemy helped to unite the whole country, and I believe it was significant in giving the Islamic Republic a way to survive. And the second point, the Iranian Revolution, the way I see it, it's mainly cultural revolution. It is not economic revolution. 1979, Iran was swimming in cash. Oil prices were very high, and it was not driven by economic needs. It is true there were problems with wealth distribution, but it was mainly cultural revolution. The Iran-Iraq war underscored the sense of victimization, that we, the Iranians, we have good values and the enemies get together against us. The Iranians saw that it was not only Saddam Hussein, it was not only Iraq, it was Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, United States, almost the entire world united against them. My study of Iran for many years, I always see this sense of victimization in Shia Islam, in Iranian psyche. So the war underscored this sense of victimization and gave birth to this asymmetric warfare. We cannot compete with the rest of the world in traditional way. We have to find new way to defend ourselves.
I have to learn to unmute myself. It helps. Gawdat, let me just push back a little bit. I mean, just before the revolution in 1979, Iran was one of the most formidable militaries around the world. I mean, it had, by one estimate, the 5th largest armed forces, decades of cooperation with the United States, one of the best air forces in the world. It had chosen a different path before 1979. I want to raise that because you talk about this sort of sense of being victim. They chose a separate path after 79. The reason why they didn't get the parts from the United States for the F-4s and the F-14s wasn't because they were Iranian or Shia, it was because they chose to be against the United States. They adopted a dogma the United States needs to leave the region. So I'm trying to get my head around, you know, where do we, what role do we attribute to the ideology of the Islamic Republic, which, you know, today, one of the biggest issues is its position on Israel. I don't know how you can justify their position on the question of Israel from a national security point of view. Please enlighten me. I'd love to learn more. And I want to link that to a question I have right after for Sara in terms of the role of one individual, Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei today. And I love to hear everyone's thought about the issue of how is the policy made in Tehran? I mean, is it bottom up or is it from the top and one individual more or less shapes it? But Gawdat, first to you and the issue of the choices that they made in 1979.
Yeah, I believe there is a big question about what is the role of religion in Iranian policy and Iranian security policy. I remember saying by Iranian man in the street, he said, during the Shah, we used to dance in public and pray in private, and under the revolution, it is the other way around. I've never been to Iran, so I cannot say how religious the Iranian population is, but Iran traditionally is interested in religion, probably more than some of its neighbors. But based on the research I did for this book and other publications, Iranian policy is very pragmatic. For sure, there is part of it ideology, especially in the beginning of the revolution, but especially Iranian security policy is very pragmatic. And probably a recent example, Iran takes Armenian side, Armenia, Christian country, not Azerbaijan, Shia country. So Iran is very pragmatic in its foreign policy and security policy. For Israel, I've been thinking and writing, reading about Iran and Israel, and I do not believe it is a religious conflict. It is not Islam vis-a-vis Judaism. It is Iran perceives itself as the dominant regional power, and Israel is the dominant power for many good reasons. And so I believe it is geography, geopolicy is the reason why Iran and Israel are against each other. It is not Islam and Judaism.
Thank you, Gawdat. And Sara, please. And we have questions on the issue of U.S. position on Israel. If there's time, we'll get to it, but it would be slightly outside the sort of focus of this panel. But thank you for the questions, and please keep them coming. Sara, tell us about Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. I mean, he is the man who basically can decide anything single-handedly. How much he does single-handedly versus listening to advisors, it's always a debate. But in terms of the perceptions we have about the man, and you know, where does the Iranian perception, the public perception, where is it in terms of the role of Khamenei in creating the conditions Iran finds itself today, both at home, but also in terms of where it is on the international stage?
Look, traditionally, all the security policies have been made by the supreme leader during, and the book rightly elaborates on this, that how during the life of Khomeini, everything was tightly controlled and you know, directed by him personally. according to the structure of the political power distribution across the Iranian political system, the supreme leader is the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. So all the military decisions, all the security decisions are directly supposedly made by him. And as you rightly mentioned, that there are other individuals involved, advisors. Sometimes people fall out of favor with him. Sometimes people gain favor over time through their achievements and through how they can bring him closer to the overall political agenda of the system. But also there is another element, and that's the role of the supreme leader in foreign policy and especially regional policy. It's very interesting because the foreign policy decision making is quite ambiguous in Iran. According to the Iranian constitution, there is a visible ambiguity on who is responsible for making foreign policy decisions. The wordings of the articles which outline within the constitution the role of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs is quite ambiguous. Majlis outlines the role of responsibilities of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs that was approved in 1985, it clearly says that the ministry is responsible for implementation of the foreign policy, not decision making, and that actually explains the recent public row that happened between Zarif, former Foreign Minister Zarif, and the Supreme Leader when the supposed leaked tape of the interview of Zarif was distributed, and he clearly said that that I always struggled with creating a balance between diplomacy and battlefield, between what he at the time when he was trying to achieve a deal with the international community, and late General Qasem Soleimani was busy with other affairs across the region. And he clearly mentions that I made a lot of compromises on various occasions. I had to make compromises in diplomacy because we had to make advances in the battlefield. Quite obviously, the battlefield is more favored by the Supreme Leader, and it's more in line with the Supreme Leader's personal agenda, or at least this is our understanding. As you mentioned, this is the leader. The leader we're talking about has not given one single news interview in his entire political career. He always sits down and gives the speeches. He always talks at people rather than being questions or being responsible for providing explanations. So our understanding of him is quite limited. We're trying to connect the dots, and this is the general consensus that we have. There is also another institution in addition to the MFA and the Supreme Leader's office, and that is the Supreme National Council, Security Council, which, according to the article number 176 of the Constitution, is in charge of making several decisions that are related to that. I'm going to read from the text, the exact translation. The council is responsible for making defense and security policies within the overarching guidance and strategies by the Supreme Leader, and liaison of the political, intelligence, social, cultural activities related to defense and security strategies. And at the end of this article, it's clearly mentioned that all the decisions of the Council must be approved by the Supreme Leader before they can be implemented. So whilst the Supreme Council over and over by the regime is presented as this consensus building mechanism, democratic, amazing tool that we try to bring all the voices into all of our decision makings, in practice, it is actually a very single voice environment, and it delegates a lot of power to the Supreme Leader.
Thank you, Sarah. That's wonderful. And I don't know what happened to our good man, Gawdat. Hopefully he'll find his way back to this Zoom event. But let me have a quick follow-up question for you, Sarah, and then I'll turn to Anoush. I mean, what you just described in terms of the Supreme National Security Council, there are roughly 12 individuals that sit there. 5 of them are directly appointed by Khamenei anyways. And the other 5, 6, 7 in that body wouldn't have been in any position of seniority had they not been approved by Khamenei. So this idea that somebody with a different style and approach and vision could somehow be sitting in the Supreme National Security Council without Khamenei wanting him to, and it would be a him, there are no she's, that I think it's far-fetched. So Khamenei controls the whole setup. There is the politics, the theater of showing that there is consensus, but really he's the one with the one veto that matters. Very quick question, Sarah, and then I'll turn to Great, Gawdat is back. We have a question. Does Ibrahim Raisi matter? And please be brief in your answer on this one, because we could go and speak about him for a long time. But does he matter in the realm of foreign policy decision making?
The reason that Raisi was elected or selected or appointed, whichever we choose to call it, was that he was the person that was trusted by the supreme leader. So whether he has power or not, those decisions are going to be very much in line with the supreme leader agenda.
Thank you.
Very short answer.
Thank you, Sara. Gawdat, good that you're back. Let me ask Anoush so you can make yourself comfortable, but I'll come back to you. And this is a question for both of you. Anoush, this idea of the proxy model, the forward defense, as they call it in Persian. Forward defense, in some ways, when we're talking about the Iran-Iraq war, being able to recruit Iraqi Shia prisoners to join Iran and sort of help in the fight against Saddam, that's one thing. That makes sense. I mean, in the United States, they call that special forces. But when you are in a country like, say, Syria, almost 10 years into that conflict, and the war is ended, and you're still there, and you're sort of figuring out what your next mandate is, that's no longer a military mission. That's something entirely different. So forward defense, I mean, what's the future of forward defense? This Iranian economy that's on the brink, and the Iranian people that are so upset, I mean, where's the money going to come from? In your book, you have a number of about $10 billion being spent in Syria. I mean, that was probably before the sanctions, because right now $10 billion in Iran would keep the economy going forward for months. So where's the money going to come from? What's the vision? Where's forward defense going?
Thanks, Alex. Let me package it around the instability in asymmetrical warfare, right? Mm-hmm. This is not a sustainable long-term defense strategy, right? It is a result of having to make do and then institutionalizing many of those features of asymmetrical warfare. It is typical. Today's Reuters, if you folks have had a chance to look at it, opens its article on Iran's Zulfiqar 1400 military exercises with a photograph that Iran's defense ministry had issued of 2 Phantom aircraft sitting on the canopy. For those who know this aircraft, know that the technology is 1960s technology. Iran got them in the early 1970s, and it still features on the front line or in Iran's defense projection, if you like. That tells you a great deal about the weaknesses that asymmetrical warfare contain, right? You cannot fight direct campaigns with blogs, cyber, and drones. You can put up a hell of a good fight. You can't defeat an enemy only with missiles, and you can't win a war only with your partners and proxy non-state actors. And that eventually these will become unstuck. And the first one that has become unstuck is the use of the proxies and partners in regional conflicts, partly because those theaters are not controlled by Iran. Iran is entering those theaters as an intervening party. It cannot dictate the direction of military conflict there. It can only help defend its allies and what it regards to be its interests. And beyond that, it's got very little control over the Syrian state, very little control over the Iraqi state. On Iraq, by the way, you did say that Iran recruited the Shias to fight on their behalf against Saddam, but also eventually they got them into power in Iraq on their behalf as well. So there was a longer term payback from that little intervention and Saddam's eviction of the Shias from Iraq. But so if you look at not just Syria, but in Lebanon, where there is tremendous amount of groundswell of opposition to what Hezbollah is doing. In Iraq, groundswell opposition and discontent with what Iranian militias are doing. In Yemen, where Iran's relationship with the Houthis remains at best tenuous, you can see the outer limits of using proxies for strategic reasons. They are not. There are tactical tools that Iran has deployed. It has used them well. The 34-day war against Israel was a good example of how partners in that case, not proxies, Hezbollah was able to put up a considerable defense against Israel, and that Hamas has been used in the same capacity. But the Fatimiyun that go from Afghanistan to fight on Iran's behalf and on Assad's behalf in Syria are not a major fighting force. These are there by virtue of Iran's cash, and it will go back when the cash runs up. How do you maintain your presence in the face of these shortcomings? So in many ways, the answer to your question, Alex, I'll cut the long story short, is precisely where the resources begin to dry up, you need to invent other forms of asymmetrical campaigning. And while this works in some places, and that's why we deliberately draw this distinction between partners and proxies. Iran may ditch its proxies, but is unlikely to let go of its partners in that context.
Thank you, Anoush and Gawdat. So I wanted to sort of ask the same question from your perspective. Where is Iran's forward defense strategy likely to go? And let me link it up to a question we have. And the question asks, is Iran less stable than Iraq, Syria, or Lebanon? Question mark. How are you judging stability? If I could quickly add Yemen to it as well, because I think those 4 Arab countries where you see the biggest Iranian investments, and to Anoush's point, you know, none of these are firmly under Iranian control. I mean, Lebanon is a failed state at best right now, will be a drain for Iran, and Iran that can't afford it. Syria, it's anybody's guess who's going to get those big reconstruction contracts if that happens. Yemen, it's even too early to talk about reconstruction. We haven't even ended the war there. So in this forward defense, I mean, what would it be looking like if it was a genuine success and a win in the long term now that the military battles have been won?
Thank you, Alex. And Iran's proxies raise the point about foreign intervention. In every single conference I go to, somebody raises the question that Iran controls 4 Arab capitals, and the term foreign intervention is bad. Nobody would like a foreign country to intervene in domestic affairs of another country. But in reality, all countries do intervene in each other's affairs. I mean, Turkey occupies part of Syria, Egypt intervenes in Libya, Saudi Arabia in Yemen, UAE in Yemen. So foreign intervention is the norm in international relations. For Iran, it is, as you said, it is costly, it is expensive, but it is helping the regime to survive. Probably a good example, ISIS almost ran out Iraq and came close to the Iranian borders. Iranian intervention in Iraq helped to defeat ISIS. I mean, the United States, as democracy, it takes some time to make decisions to support a ally like Iraq, but Iran was very quick to intervene and stop ISIS advances. The Iranians also are proud that, unlike the Shah, the Islamic Republic does not give up on its proxies, on its allies. As you remember, right before the revolution, the Shah changed the policy with the Kurds and made peace with Saddam Hussein. The Iranian Islamic Republic leaders say they are not the Shah, they are different. So the policy is expensive, it is costly, but it keeps the regime alive. And the Iranians say, if we do not fight extremists in Damascus, we will fight them in Tehran.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Gawdat. Sara, let me ask you again another question on Khamenei, and you're probably going to dislike me if I keep going back to the same individual, but he is so powerful. He deserves so much of our time. You know, Khamenei is somebody who does not want to own a policy failure. So when he's not sure where something is going, there is silence. And he'll, you know, that's basically where he is right now. And we're only a few weeks away from the resumption of the talks on the 29th of November in Vienna. But he's 82 years old. Ayatollah Khomeini, before he died, he made the decision to end the Iran-Iraq war because he felt that would preserve the Islamic Republic. Khamenei could make a similar decision by reaching a deal on the nuclear issue, maybe even broaden the conversation to talk about other matters in the Middle East, doesn't necessarily mean just Iran makes concessions. It could be a two-way street where Iran can demand concessions in return. So a genuine dialogue. But Khamenei could be the person, needs to be the person who launches that kind of a process. Nobody else in Tehran dares to say those words. Nobody. So why does Khamenei, why is he so intimidated? Why does he think he would lose political capital or control by taking a different approach to the big issue of what to do with the United States the day he's gone?
First of all, let me tell you that I don't feel too bad about asking too many questions about Khamenei, because my current project is basically text mining his speeches and trying to do a network analysis on the keywords that he uses. So I never would have imagined that my academic life would turn into reading Khamenei's speeches on a daily basis. And but that's the pleasure that I'm having these days. And I'm telling you that his rhetoric is quite strong. Sometimes I joke with my colleagues that sooner or later I'm going to turn into one of his staunch supporters. He does have a strong way of using certain words and a strong way of sending messages across. And I think there are a few things involved in here that why he chose this path. One is that what we know about, very little we know about his person, his characteristic as an individual, from people who have shared prison cells, for example, with him in previous regime during the Shah, or people who have turned their backs on him and then they came out and they came out of Iran and they started talking about the way that his vision is, and he formulates his agenda. He's generally quite a stubborn person individually. So for him as a person, making such U-turns is quite difficult. And it was amazingly obvious in the recent statement that Saeed Khatibzadeh, the spokesperson of MFA, just released yesterday. And he said, one of the conditions we want from the United States is an apology on behalf of Trump for withdrawing from JCPOA. I mean, in what twisted world and a written apology or a thank you note from the White House is going to resolve any of the negative consequences of JCPOA withdrawal? I have no idea, but it's quite clearly important for the Iranians and for the elite in Iran, and they are obviously receiving certain directions from certain elements, i.e., here being the supreme leaders as an institution. He also has his image domestically for him is quite important, because he have always tend to distance himself from certain decisions and formulate his wording in a way that if it was successful, everybody would come and kiss his hand and thank him for his very obvious guidelines and supports. And if it went sour, he could say, well, I told you so. During as the negotiations were going on in Iran, there were banners that were put up in motorways that showed a table. Underneath the table there are military boots, and above the table it's suit and ties, people sitting in suit and ties, showing that whilst we are negotiating on the table with them, we know deep down that they're going to in the end go after us. So for him, making this U-turn, although he knows that it's quite important, is a very difficult personal ideological decision. And also he sees the preserving the regime and the longevity of the regime in making alliance with Russia, China, and expansion of its power regionally, because ultimately he knows that if he carries on with this rhetoric of the second phase of revolution and so on and so forth, he might be able to continue with this alliance, at least at domestic level, with suppression and with grooming his own elected individuals into the position of supreme leader after.
Thank you, Sarah. You win a special prize for mentioning China 5 minutes before we finish the panel. You can't have a panel in DC without mentioning China. So let me do that. Let me ask Anoush and Gawdat to say a few words about the role of Russia and China in this. I mean, they're there in the book throughout. The Revolutionary Guards, as we know, have close relations with the Russians. Have had it for a long time. Increasingly, there is a Chinese military dimension, being a large economic partner for a long time. The question is now, with Iran having joined the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, would that make any difference in practice? But just give a sense of to Sarah's point that, will Russia and China save Iran from the West, if you will, if that's the proposition? Where do you stand on those two countries? I don't know who wants to go first. Anoush, you want to go first, and then Gawdat can wrap up.
Sure thing. I think there is a domestic, regional, and international global dimension to this, Alex. The domestic is that what Iran is seeing in terms of American withdrawal, Afghanistan, and this repositioning is the final realization of America can't do anything. The Khomeini rhetoric that they've been praying, looking in their crystal ball for the demise of American power in the region, and hey presto, Khomeini's ideology is proving that in the end the Americans will go and are going, and that's a success for that ideological issue, that Iran's domestic narrative of neither East nor West is actually the reality that was Khomeini's ideas 40 odd years ago. The second is regional. We also talk in the book about Iran's isolation in the region. That isolation is material, it's real. For all the relationships that it has in these other Arab cities and capitals, it doesn't have much in the Caucasus, in the future Afghanistan, in Arab-Israeli theater, in anything to do with the Arab Spring. Iran is isolated, frozen out of all of this. It needs to look elsewhere. And the third, perhaps most important dimension is the international level, where there is, whether we like it or not, a process of systemic shift, where global economic and subsequent diplomatic power, political power, is shifting away from the Atlantic towards Asia. And the pivot of that is China, without a question. And that Iran's look east is now matched by China's look west. The BRI brings these two parties of Asia together, and it gives both Iran and China the opportunity to stitch up, if you like, Eurasia. Russia is the joker here, because Russia is scared of China on the one hand, wants to maintain good relations with it, and a presence in the region as well. But also, it has different priorities in Syria and in the Caucasus when it comes to Iran. And of course, ultimately, Russia is an oil competitor of Iran as well. But so long as the security partnership persists, Moscow and Tehran will continue to kiss each other's cheeks.
Great, thank you, Anoush. Gawdat, you get the, unless Sarah insists, then if that's okay, Gawdat, you get the last words, please. Anything else that you would like to add, including on the issue of Russia and China in Iran's defense sort of calculations, or anything else that you like to sort of finish us off with?
Thank you. I know we are getting close to 11, so I will be very brief, and I will make two brief points. One, to Sarah's point about Khamenei, I do not expect any compromise from him, mainly because he perceives United States as refusing to accept the Iranian revolution. The way I understand it, it's like you do not talk to me because the color of my skin. In his own words, it's not about the nuclear program. It is about who the Iranian revolution is about, Iranian revolution values. And this is why I do not expect any compromise from him. Unlike the war with Iraq, it was not about who the Iranian revolution is. The other point about China and Russia, I believe the two countries are taking advantage of the relative weakness of Iran now. Iran is, as you mentioned and other people said about Iran's isolation, Iran is down, it is not out, and Russia, like the conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan, Russia is shaping the settlement in its favor against Iran. China is taking very cheap oil. So the two countries are taking advantage of Iran. The Iranian leaders understand it. I believe this will change when the big picture changes. At the same time, Russia and China have to balance their relations with Iran with their relations with Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Israel. So I do not believe they will save Iran, and I also still believe the Iranian public is more pro-West than pro-Russia and China. Thank you.
Thank you. Sarah, it would be unfair. Any last thoughts? You want to maybe recommend the book one more time? It's a wonderful book.
Absolutely, yes. I totally recommend it. And I once told Anoush that if in my entire academic career, I write one book like one of yours, I would just retire. So congratulations. Thank you very much. And Alex, thank you for hosting.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you for being with us. I don't think these two gentlemen are ready to retire just yet. So we should be glad they're not. They have wonderful things to say. They've been long-term observers of this part of the world. Everything they write is worth reading, and I certainly recommend this book. It's a very rich book, timely book defending Iran from revolutionary guards to ballistic missiles. Again, I recommend it. Please go and get yourself a copy. And thank you all for joining us. I apologize for not having been able to take all the questions. We're out of time, but this was a wonderful discussion, and we look forward to having you all back at another event at